Presenting the second half of Chapter 3 of Rufeepeach's You Can't Be Too Careful Anymore. Thank you. Belle eventually pushed herself out of his arms, and Rumpelstiltskin felt keenly the loss of her warm weight, her arms around his shoulders. But she was standing, and he stood with her and watched as she went about smoothing her new shirt and wiping at her face to clear the evidence of her distress. He smiled slightly, unsure of how to proceed, and she smiled back. It was weak, watery, false, but he allowed it. She needed to pull her skin back across herself, cover her exposed wounds, and he wouldn't deny her that. The scars still burned the flesh of her forearm, and he was caught with the inexplicable urge to run his lips over them, to kiss the pain away and soothe all of her aches, her hurts. He wanted to start with those scars, though, those words carved into her delicate, innocent skin that could prove indelible. He could apply all the magical salves and treatments he wanted to her wounds, but no matter how smooth he made her skin, the existence of those words wouldn't change. They had scarred her, branded her, and even with the slate washed clean, those words were carved into her memory. She was not a demon, not even close, and he would personally squeeze the life from any bastard who decided to tell her otherwise. He knew demons, and all he saw in her was a broken little girl in need of some power, some dignity. He hoped that teaching her to control her magic would help with that. That was why he'd granted her new clothing. Her dresses were far too flammable, far too likely to get caught in things or burn or simply get in the way. He hadn't thought about his own reaction. He was a horrid, twisted, evil old monster, and he couldn't deny how fetching she looked in her new tight trousers and one of his old shirts. Perhaps that alone was the problem. He may have fitted it for a female form, but her top came from his own wardrobe, and there was a certain possessiveness in his soul that was pleased by that. Her shape was splattered and shown off to a much greater degree, the cloth clinging to curves like a second skin, and until she had her episode, he had found it difficult to keep his eyes on the wheel and off his new apprentice. Fortunately, her sobbing had removed some of that problem for him. It reminded him what he was dealing with. Rumpelstiltskin liked broken things. He truly did. He believed the damage done to an item had only increased its value, made it new and different and special, and she was so prettily shattered. He had broken people himself before, and laughed as he did. He had to wonder how many people had fallen into other arms, sobbed as she had, fallen apart the way Belle had done so violently, so easily, because of his own cruelty. The damage done to her was appalling, grotesque. To take someone with such raw and unique power and turn them into themselves, to create a demon from their own self-doubt, to devour them whole, well, that took a certain level of pure malevolence that both impressed and sickened him. She finally looked up, met his eyes. I'm sorry. I'll clear this all away. It's no matter. He waved her off and was about to say something about how magic could sort out the mess. She needn't trouble herself. She was no longer a maid, but she was already marching from the room with her arms full of dishes, and he figured that if helping out made her more comfortable, then he wouldn't deny her. He left her in the kitchens, assumed she'd want some time alone after the emotional thunderstorm she just put herself through, and busied himself in the west tower. It was old, underused, but clean and safe like the rest of the castle, and the perfect place to start their training. He filled one room with books, any book on magic he could find that was neither too advanced nor too dark for Belle's education. There was even a small fireplace. She could practice her magic for something useful, he reasoned, and a couple of armchairs. She would be the only one reading in here, and yet he got 2 chairs from the library. He didn't analyze that. It made the room look more balanced, and that was the only reason he was comfortable with accepting. Balance was important when around one whose powers were as potentially volatile as hers. A second room, larger, at the very top of the tower, he filled with only 2 cushions and 3 massive crates of firewood. Here he would teach her to use her magic practically, so everything needed to be expendable or non-flammable. Only the 2 velvet cushions served for comfort, for he didn't know how long their lessons would last, and there was no way he was sitting on a cold stone floor for hours at a time. If they burned, he would summon new ones. Arranging the training rooms to his liking took a good few hours, and even when he emerged, hoping to find her and show off his work, if he was honest with himself, she was still nowhere to be seen. He thought of calling for her, but perhaps she needed her privacy. Perhaps she was ashamed of what had happened that morning, or of how he had seen her the night before. She had been shamefully underdressed, covered in bruises and bleeding cuts, and he had had to peel the most of her shift off of her in bits and pieces to tend her wounds. He had tried not to peek, tried to maintain her modesty. It was his fault that she had been caught, that she felt so terribly about herself, the most powerful sorcerer in the realms, and he hadn't managed to pick up on the untamed and destructive powers of one small girl. Her magic should have screamed at him, and he was too busy throwing her in dungeons and posturing to notice. He owed her her dignity, if nothing else. No matter that. Had she been anyone else, he would not have thought twice about examining the damage properly to make sure that there was nothing potentially fatal. No matter that it has been his arms around her that first time that had sparked her inferno. It had seemed horribly wrong, distasteful, and shameful to strip Belle's clothing off without her express permission. Even though he had to make sure she wasn't bleeding to death, even though it was entirely for medical purposes, above board and proper, even though he could take no pleasure at all in the sight with her so thoroughly mangled and damaged by clerics and the Queen. If she wished to hide herself now, if she wished him not to see her, to cry and regain her center without anyone else's eyes on her, then he could not deny her that. So he spent his afternoon spinning and trying not to remember the sight of her that morning, the memory he stored in his mind of her behind in those tight trousers he'd provided. It was only when night fell, and there was no sign of her making dinner in the kitchen or in her room or even in the library, that he started to worry. What if he'd left her alone too long and she'd done something stupid to herself? What if her magic had returned at full strength and she was trapped somewhere in the castle, burning and crying and screaming for him? He searched the castle the way he had the day before when he found her at the Queen's palace, and strangely, her glow, fully returned but restrained and stable for now, came from the dungeons. Why would she hide in the cellars? He appeared in the shadows outside her old cell. Belle? A small sound of recognition came from inside, and he walked into the doorway to find her sat there, dry-eyed and staring at the wall, hands around her knees. She turned to look at him, and recognition, not to mention a little bit of horror, dawned on her face. "Oh, no!" she cried, swinging her legs over the little cot and standing. "I forgot dinner, didn't I?" "Yes, dearie, but that's not my concern. I'm forgetting my duties. Oh, gods, I'm so sorry." She sounded ready to explode again, and he had to wonder just how much emotion one small girl could bottle up over 20 years of restraint. "Your duties are to learn to control your powers," he said, calmly, reasonably, his voice measured and even. "That's all. You bargained for a caretaker. Circumstances change, dearie. An apprentice is a much more suitable occupation. My magic fed, clothed, and cleaned for me in the 300 years prior to your arrival. It can continue to do so now." "Oh." She looked at her boots and appeared so small and fragile it hurt to look. "Okay. You can still do those things if it pleases you, I suppose." He flipped his hand negligently, trying desperately to bring back her smile. "But, as of today, you are relieved from your duties." "All right." He could see just the hint of a smile at the corners of her mouth, and it was like the sun coming out. "Good." He looked around the dungeon and felt a stab of something that strongly resembled guilt that he'd made her sleep here for so long. How much of her damage was his fault in treating her so harshly her first month here, that even with a nice new bedroom upstairs she chose to hide in a prison cell? Why are you down here? She frowned at him in utter confusion. I needed some sleep? You have a bed upstairs, dearie, if that's what you needed. She shook her head. You said that this was my room. I didn't want to disturb you. I did enough of that this morning, and I needed some time alone. He felt sick to his stomach. How awful must she think him if she believed he would keep her here now after all that had happened? That she wouldn't know right away that the room she'd slept in last night was hers to keep, filled with her things and her new clothing? How cruel must he truly be, without even thinking or realizing it, for her to fear him so without his even trying. He paused, thinking. In light of recent events, this is no longer a suitable room for you. The one you stayed in last night should suffice. A new room? It's mine? If you'll have it. Why? She was beaming, actually beaming, and he could see the glow around her as the room grew unbearably warm. Thank you. What did I say about gratitude? He growled, but he was smiling all the while, and even she could see that he was teasing. You deserve it. You're being so much better to me than I deserve. He didn't even try to argue. There was no point. She would never believe she was worthy of so much more than he could provide simply on his word. He simply beckoned for her to follow and led her upstairs to the new rooms he'd made for her, the chambers he would have given to her weeks ago were he not too cowardly to apologize. Now, no more running down to the dungeons, do you hear me? He commanded, waving one finger in her face when they reached the doorway to her bedroom. She nodded, biting her lip to suppress a laugh, and for one brief and horrifying moment, he wanted more than anything to lean down and kiss her, to bite her lips for her and see if she tasted as warm as she made him feel. But then she was off, spinning in the open space, bare feet on the plush carpet, and he could see the candles burning brighter as she did so. He would have to drain her power again tonight, lest her joy burn down his entire castle. In that moment, he would have considered it a fair sacrifice. Thank you.